Good morning. It's nice and early here in the Spade household. We're going to take a look at the second part of First Corinthians 12. So let me share my screen so you don't have to look at me. You'll see that I've already copied the text here with us, 1 Corinthians 12. And as we usually do, I will go through and begin to highlight some of the conjunctions that begin to tell us a little bit about the relationships. Now, the first thing that we see here, um, the comparison, just as a body, though one has many parts, so it is with Christ. So we get this comparison, we get the repetition of the word body. Um, the whole passage talks about body, and of course it's equating the body to Christ. um, we are altogether the body of Christ, so we begin to see those relationships. We also noticed the contrast, and the contrast is kind of summarized here between the one and the many. All together we are one. All together we are the body, but individually we are members of the body. Now, starting here in verse 15, we begin to see the way this uh, works out. Paul has a couple of different things that he begins to say. First of all, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the ear were to say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. So we have this repetition as well, just in these two verses. But that's important. That sets those two verses apart. Then he has kind of a new topic here. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? And again, the contrast. If in fact God has placed the parts of the body, or the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If his summary statement of this little section, if all were one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. And then next topic, the eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you. The head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker or indispensable, the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. So we have this contrast here between weak and honor. Oh, let's see here. How do we want to? Let's indicate that contrast with the double line here. The parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it. Now, this does seem to be a separate section here. He's kind of summarizing all of these first three uh, categories. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, it's not for that reason, not a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? And the eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you. So, summarizing all of this, God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers. If one part is honored, every part rejoices. Then he comes down to brass tacks. Here he begins to explain what he means by this whole section when he's talking about the gifts. And this appears to be this statement: you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. Appears to be the point that he's trying to make. This summarizes everything. Then, here at the very end, he says, uh, God is placed in the church, first of all, prophets, apostles, then prophets, then teachers. He puts the gifts in an order, and he does that in verse 28. Then in verse 29, he has a series of questions. And then in verse 31, the final statement, um, desire the greater gifts. Okay, so let's come down here to the end and let's start looking back at what we have and seeing if we can um, figure out what Paul is saying. Let's make our observations here. First of all, first observation, let's start with that central teaching. That central teaching, remember, is up here in this verse. Now you are the body of Christ. Each one of you is a part of it. That. So central teaching, you are together the body of Christ. And you are individually members of the body of Christ. If we go back up here to the very start, we see that Paul kind of begins to hint at that in his opening statement here. Just as a body, though one has many parts, but all of its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. And then he gives a reason. Remember, the word for indicates that a reason follows. So let's just write down this reason. We're all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body. Whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, we're all given the one Spirit to drink. So uh, the reason for this, we're baptized in one Spirit. We drink of that one Spirit. Now, right now, we're not going to worry too much about what it means to drink of the Spirit. If we were going really deep in this passage, we would want to look for that phrase in the rest of the New Testament. We're not going to do that, partly because it doesn't occur again, partly because that study is not overly productive. It still leaves us with a number of questions. But the one thing that we do see is that come on here. There we go. We're all equal. Whether Jew or Gentile, whether slave or free. Now, think about that a little bit. Whether Jew or Gentile, that would mean a lot to the Jewish community in the church. Whether slave or free, that would mean a lot to the Roman community in the church. So Paul is talking to both here. Now let's take a look at the body comparison. So much of the passage has to do with comparing the body of Christ with the human body. And the first point of comparison that we see up here is, now if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being a part of the body. If the ear were to say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, same thing. So what Paul is talking about there is feelings in the body of inferiority. So he's saying there that there is no room for feelings of inferiority. Now that second section, if the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But God has placed the parts of the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? In this section, what he's saying is that there is no room for uniformity in the body of Christ, for saying that everybody must be like me, or must be like even Paul in the body of Christ. And then the last section, the eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you. The head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary. And then Paul gets into some realities. The parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. Now, by weaker, he's probably talking about things like internal organs, uh, parts of the body that are less honorable, we treat with special honor. When we get ready to go out today, what do? We spend a lot of time fixing our hair. Women might uh, put their hair in a certain shape. Men might scrape hair off of their face. Um, we spend more time with parts of the body that are dispensable, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking, I need to get my kidneys in order before I go out, do we? So what Paul is saying here is there is no room for feelings of superiority in the body. Now he has a last statement here, but God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers. If one part is honored, every part rejoices. What Paul is saying there is that God has given the gifts to the church so that there should be no division, but that the parts should have equal concern for each other. So in this section, let's just list that as a summary statement. God gives gifts to the church to unify the church. God gives to the church to help us work together. This is interesting because there are a few things in the church today that divide the church more than the gifts. What God has given to us to unify the church, we have taken and used to separate us. Now, Paul ends this section with a direct application to the gifts. And in this section, what Paul does in this very end section, he talks first of all, very interesting. He has kind of two divisions here. What we might call primary gifts. First of all, apostles, second prophets, third teachers, and then miracles, gifts of healing, of helping, of guidance, of different kinds of tongues. Now, it is interesting. Paul has not even talked about these things, but these are three of the five gifts that he mentions in Ephesians chapter 4. And then these gifts are gifts that he mentions in 1 Corinthians 12, 8 to 11, and in Romans 12, 6 to 8, except for this gift, a gift of guidance. Okay, so the application to the gifts, there may be primary gifts for the church that are listed in Ephesians 4:11, and secondary gifts for the church. Let's make this a definite statement instead of now, when I say primary and secondary, I think what Paul is saying is that the primary gifts listed in Ephesians 4 must be present for the functioning of the church. But the secondary gifts that are listed in Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12, these are things that individual members can have in the church, and it blesses the church. But for the church to function, they need the primary gifts. We get a second thought here. Just because of the way Paul is talking here and because of the way he lists the gifts at this point, it appears that the list is suggestive, not exhaustive. So today we could very validly talk about a gift of music. That's not mentioned in any of the lists, but it blesses the church when it's used. Now, the other thing that we do see here very clearly, Paul says, are all apostles, are all prophets, are all teachers, do all work miracles? In your study, if you were reading a commentary, what you would read at this point is that there are two ways of asking a question in Greek. One marks it as a rhetorical question, which requires the answer no. The other is an open question that seeks an answer. These are all rhetorical questions. These all require the answer no. And so we can say no gift is universal. We all have different gifts. There is no one of these gifts that everybody must have. We come then to the final statement of Paul, eagerly desire the greater gifts. And it may be that what Paul is saying to here is we are to desire the primary gifts that he mentions above, because it's necessary for the functioning of the church. The church can't really be the church if it doesn't have apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. The church requires those gifts. And when Paul talks about the primary gifts, he may be talking about, or when Paul talks about the greater gifts, he indeed may be talking about the primary gifts. Well, that's the second half of chapter 12. There's some very, very neat teaching here. I'll save this document and I'll attach it to the description of this video. So if you want to pull this particular document up and take a closer look at it, you can. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today. And we will see you tomorrow or next week with 1 Corinthians 13, which fits very closely to this section on gifts. See you later.